Welcome back to another AP Live AP Macroeconomics lesson. My name is Jen Rayfields. I'm coming to you from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, and I'm excited to finish up our review videos tonight with Unit 5. We're going to put all of the concepts and topics of Unit 5 together into one video, and then next week we're going to spend our time reviewing free response questions. All right, so let's get right into it. So because we're looking at the whole unit, I thought I would take a, no pun intended, macro approach to thinking about the most important ideas in this concept. So the course and exam description is really helpful for that, and it identifies the following big ideas. So we're looking in this unit at the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. We're also looking at the long run implications of fiscal and monetary policy. And finally, we're going to conclude with a discussion of how the economy grows. So those are the big ideas that are covered in this unit. And if you think of those as the questions we want to be able to answer, then that leads us into our enduring understandings. So the first enduring understanding in this unit is associated with topic 5.1. That's simultaneous exercise of fiscal and monetary policy. So we've spent so much time already reviewing short-run implications of fiscal policy and monetary policy. I'm not going to spend any time on that tonight, but next week when we review, we'll see some FRQs that have simultaneous monetary and fiscal policy in them. So we're going to spend time trying to make sure that you feel really confident with the understanding that the Phillips curve model is used to represent the relationship between inflation and unemployment in both the short run and the long run, and to illustrate how macroeconomic shocks affect the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Then we're going to spend some time really considering the long run implications of monetary and fiscal policy. And we're going to conclude with the discussion of the difference between a short run output gap and long run economic growth. We're going to look at the factors that contribute to long run economic growth. And then we're going to come back to that fiscal policy and talk about the implications of fiscal policy for long run economic growth. All right, so that's where we're headed this evening. So we're going to split it up into chunks, and we're going to start with this relationship between inflation and unemployment that's characterized in the Phillips curve model. So we're just going to review the key concepts. So let's start with the model by making sure that we know that the Phillips curve model is one of the models in this course that is not a supply and demand model. So we're still graphing the relationship between two variables, as we always do when we use a model, but in this case, we're graphing the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So the convention is to have the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. So in the short run, you've learned there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And so we reflect that relationship in a downward sloping short run Phillips curve. And what this illustrates is that when the inflation rate is high, unemployment is low, right? So a point on the curve that's got a high level of inflation is going to correspond with a low rate of unemployment. And then the reverse is true as well. When the unemployment rate is low, when the inflation rate is low, the unemployment rate is high. So you can find a point on the Phillips curve that shows that. So here we are establishing this inverse relationship, right? And the short run Phillips curve shows that in the short run, this trade-off exists. Now, in the long run, however, we know that there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And so we graph that relationship as a vertical line. So the long run Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment, which is sometimes referred to as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So the short run Phillips curve, downward sloping, long run Phillips curve is a vertical line. And what the long run Phillips curve tells us is that once inflationary expectations adjust to meet the actual rate of inflation, the economy can operate at full employment levels of output and at the natural rate of unemployment at any rate of inflation. So that's what that curve tells us. All right, so what you've also learned is that shifts of the aggregate demand curve correspond with movements along a given short run Phillips curve, and that shifts of the short run aggregate supply curve correspond with shifts of the short run Phillips curve. But one of the things that you also really want to keep in mind is that neither shifts of aggregate demand or short run aggregate supply are going to shift the long run Phillips curve. The long run Phillips curve is a function of the natural rate of unemployment. So it is only changes in the natural rate of unemployment that are going to cause shifts of the long run Phillips curve, and changes in the actual rate of unemployment will not. All right. So those are the key concepts with the Phillips curve model. Now let's connect the ADAS model and the Phillips curve model together to see how they complement each other. So remember that in the ADAS model, we're graphing the relationship between the price level and real GDP. And in the Phillips curve model, we're graphing the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So I'm going to put some actual numbers into the model just to make it more concrete. One thing I want you to notice is that the unemployment rate on the vertical axis here is on the horizontal axis here is the unemployment rate. So as we move up along the horizontal axis here, the unemployment rate is rising. When we're talking about real GDP and we're moving up along the horizontal axis, the employment rate is rising, but the unemployment rate is falling. So if you're moving this way on the ADAS model in terms of output, then the unemployment rate is actually declining. So just keep that in mind. When we're actually graphing the unemployment rate, then we're showing the increases in the unemployment rate, which would be corresponding with decreasing output over here on the ADAS model. So don't get tripped up with that. A lot of times kids want to graph a recessionary gap in the Phillips curve model incorrectly because they think of falling unemployment as going this way. And on the Phillips curve model, rising unemployment is going this way. Okay. All right, so now we're going to assume that the natural rate of unemployment in this economy is 5%. So we can draw long run equilibrium in the ADAS model at the point where short run at aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long run aggregate supply all intersect. We've got our full employment levels of output. Now, what this tells us at equilibrium is that the unemployment rate is 5%. And I remember that the price level over here, this is the aggregate price level, and we're often talking about the GDP deflator. And the GDP deflator is an index, and it's indexed to a base year in which the GDP deflator would be 100. So just to keep the math simple, I'm going to assume that the price level or the GDP deflator is 100 in the current year, which corresponds with an expected rate of inflation of 0 and an unemployment rate of 5%. So at E1 here, we're going to graph a point in the Phillips curve model that corresponds with 5% unemployment and 0% inflation. So 5% employment would be here and 0 inflation would be right there. Okay, so that would be a point in the Phillips curve model that corresponds to this unemployment rate and this price level in the ADAS model. All right, now let's assume that we have some shock to the system and it's a demand shock and we're going to see an increase in aggregate demand. So we show that by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, which produces a new short run equilibrium E2. And we know that that's going to correspond with an increase in the full employment, an increase, shoot, that shouldn't say F, Y2 is an increase in output that corresponds with a decrease in the unemployment rate, right? So here, when output is increasing, unemployment is decreasing. So let's assume that the unemployment rate is 3%. That would be an unemployment rate that is less than 5%. Now, with the price level, let's go from 100 to 102, which would be a 2% rate of inflation. When the price level goes from 100 to 102, that reflects an inflation rate of 2%. So now, as a result of the increase in aggregate demand, we need a new point in our Phillips curve model with 3% unemployment and 2% inflation. So find 3% unemployment and 2% inflation. That would be right here. So we have this new point. You can see that we've gone this way. Unemployment has fallen and inflation has risen. There's our short run trade-off. Now, what we can show here is this is a short run Phillips curve, and I'm putting it that it's a short run Phillips curve with an expected rate of inflation of 0. And I think if you graph short run Phillips curves, understanding that it is based on some expected rate of inflation, that will make it easier for you to answer any kind of Phillips curves questions. All right, but we have also learned that an economy that's producing beyond full employment levels of output is going to experience inflation, and that, right, so as the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate of unemployment, workers are scarce. The increase in the price level that was caused by the demand shock results in a decrease in real incomes. Workers are going to bid up their wages. Employers are going to grant those wage increases because employment is scarce. And so as a result, input prices for producers is going to rise. It's going to cause short run aggregate supply to shift to the left. All right, so now let's look at what happens to output, unemployment, and the price level. So when the short run aggregate supply shifted to the left, we have a new equilibrium here back at our initial full employment level of output and an unemployment rate of 5%. However, the the price level is going to increase. Now, I'm assuming that the inflation went up by 2% again. And so what has happened is people are building into their expectations an expected rate of inflation of 2%, whereas here the expected rate of inflation was 0. So let's see, now we have a level of output with 5% unemployment, but but our inflation rate is still about 2%. I know a 2% increase from 102 is going to be a little bit greater than 104, but just to keep it simple, we're going to just put 104 here. So now when we have this decrease in short run aggregate supply, we have a new unemployment rate of 5% and an inflation rate of 2%. Well, here's our 5% unemployment rate, and here is 5% unemployment and 2% inflation. So this new point is not on our short run Phillips curve with an expected inflation rate of 0. So we need a new short run Phillips curve with an expected inflation rate of 2%. So a shift of the short run aggregate supply curve corresponds with a shift of the short run Phillips curve. When short run aggregate supply decreases, the short run Phillips curve shifts to the right. So we could repeat this pattern over and over and over again. Let's say that there was another demand shock and we have an increase in aggregate demand here. Well, now that would be an increase in the level of output with another decrease in the unemployment rate, but this time it's a decrease in the unemployment rate with an expected rate of inflation of 2%. So eventually, the output gap, the inflationary gap, would self-correct with a decrease in short run aggregate supply. That would cause our new equilibrium. That would cause our new inflation rate to be a higher inflation rate, but back at our long run equilibrium level of output with our 5% unemployment rate. And so we'd have a new point here to reflect that, okay, the economy is adjusted to long run equilibrium at 5% unemployment, but now with an expected rate of inflation of 4%. So we'd need a new short run Phillips curve with an expected rate of inflation of 4%. And this process could keep happening again and again. And if what you notice is that this is what helps us develop our long run Phillips curve. So the long run Phillips curve here is just showing that at the natural rate of unemployment, the economy can restore itself to long run equilibrium at any expected rate of inflation. So each point where SRPC equals LRPC is a point at which the expected inflation rate is equal to the actual inflation rate. And I want you to remember that for when we do our practice questions, because I think that will help. All right, so we connected the Phillips curve model to what's going on in the real economy, which we reflect in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And this allows us to see both the short run and long run relationships between inflation and unemployment. So that's one of the big ideas in this unit. Okay, so now the second big idea is how do monetary and fiscal policy affect the economy in the long run? So 5.3 is where we really explore the long run implications of monetary policy. So let's start with that. But before we do so, let's just remember when is the long run. So the long run, remember, is not a period of time. It's not measured in days, weeks, months, or years. The long run is the time period defined by the fact that all inputs in production are flexible and all input prices are flexible. So it's not a specified amount of time. It's conceptually the time period which producers can respond to changes. Producers can change up the level of inputs that they're using. When is long run equilibrium in a macroeconomy? Well, we know it's defined as the time period it's defined as the condition that exists when current output equals potential output. We also know that we can say long run equilibrium exists when the economy is producing the full employment level of output. And we can also say that it exists when the actual unemployment rate is equal to the natural unemployment rate. We have no cyclical unemployment. So all of these are different ways of expressing this idea of long run macroeconomic equilibrium. We graph it in the PPC curve by putting a point on the PPC. We could have any point on the PPC as a long run equilibrium level of output. It means the economy is producing all of the output it can with its current resources. We've graphed long run equilibrium in the ADAS model, as we've seen over and over and over again now, where the current output that's found at the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply is equal to potential output at the full employment level of output. So this is how we graph long run equilibrium. And we want to talk about what happens if the government tries to implement expansionary. We're going to be talking about expansionary policies, but it's true of contractionary policies as well. So let's start with monetary policy. So one of the key concepts here is the long run neutrality of money. And we're going to illustrate it in the ADAS model, and then we're going to illustrate it in the money market. And we're going to talk about it in terms of the monetary equation of exchange, or the quantity theory of money. So we're going to look at this concept in a couple of different ways. So remember that potential output is a function of economic resources. The PPC tells us possible combinations of consumer and capital goods that an economy can produce given some specified number of resources and assuming all of the resources are fully employed. Money is not an economic resource. Remember, money, especially in the United States economy where we use fiat money, right? The paper in and of itself has no value. The paper is only as good as the goods and services that it is accepted as a medium of exchange for. Money is not an economic resource. So therefore, it should make sense that changes to the money supply aren't going to have any impact on potential output. So if we increase the amount of money in the economy, we're not increasing our resources. So we shouldn't see changes in the money supply affect long-run economic growth. But let's prove that using our ADAS model. So we'll start with an economy that's in long-run equilibrium and assume that the government implements some expansionary monetary policy. So an expansionary monetary policy increases the money supply, leads to a decrease in nominal interest rates. That causes interest rate sensitive spending to increase, which causes aggregate demand to increase. So as aggregate demand increases, we know that we have an increase in the level of output and we have an increase in the price level. We create a short run inflationary gap. And as we know, a short run inflationary gap is going to self-correct. And so what will happen is, again, those two things. When we're producing beyond and full employment levels of output, resources are scarce, input prices are going to rise. At the same time, remember, workers' wages represent like 70% of input costs, and the increase in the price level with a given nominal wage means workers' real wages are falling. They are going to bid up their wages. Producers are firms are going to grant workers those increases in wages because employment workers are scarce. Those are going to result in a decrease in profitability, which shifts the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. The economy is restored to full employment levels of output with a new higher equilibrium price level. So what we see here is that the long run effects of expansionary monetary policy produce no change in real GDP, no change in the no long run change in the actual unemployment rate, and only an increase in the price level. Right, so that's one way to show the long run neutrality of money. We can also show it using the quantity theory of money, which you'll remember asserts that the amount of money that is exchanged in an economy is equal to the value of the goods and services sold in the economy. And we express that mathematically using the monetary equation of exchange, which is written as M times V equals P times Y, which means the money supply times the velocity of money is equal to nominal GDP, where P stands for the price level and Y stands for real GDP, real output. Okay, so we're going to assume the economy again is in long run equilibrium where current output is equal to potential output, and we're going to bring up our money market model. So we've got the money market here with nominal interest rates and quantity of money. We have our downward sloping money demand curve, which shows the inverse relationship between the nominal interest rate and the money held by consumers. It means, right, this is what you reviewed yesterday. And the money supply is vertical. It's independent of the nominal interest rate. Okay, so we have that we find the equilibrium nominal interest rate where the money demand is, where the quantity of money demanded is equal to the quantity of money supplied. All right, and let's assume that the Fed conducts some expansionary monetary policy, which would produce an increase in the money supply and a decrease in nominal interest rates. So we'd go from this equilibrium interest rate to this equilibrium nominal interest rate. Well, let's see what happens over here. The increase in the money supply leads to a decrease in nominal interest rates, which is designed to increase aggregate demand. And if we have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, that increase in aggregate demand is going to cause an increase in real GDP and an increase in the price level. But it's also going to create an inflationary gap because we're in long run equilibrium to begin with. So increases in aggregate demand are going to give us an increase in real GDP and an increase in the price level, but we're going to end up in a short run equilibrium in an inflationary gap. So let's use our monetary equation of exchange to describe what's happening. The increase in the money supply, assuming the velocity of money is constant, leads to an increase in real GDP and the price level. So Y is increasing, right? That's the increase in real GDP, and the price level is increasing. But now let's watch what happens. The increase in the price level is going to cause an increase in the demand for money. Remember, a change in the price level is a determinant of the money demand curve. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a shortage of money at the equilibrium interest rate, which is going to cause the equilibrium nominal interest rate to rise. We're going to end up at a new equilibrium back at the initial nominal interest rate. So let's see what happens over here. The increase in the price level causes an increase in money demand, which causes an increase in the nominal interest rate. So in the long run, there was not change in the nominal interest rate as a result of the expansionary monetary policy. And because the inflationary gap corrects itself by a decrease in short run aggregate supply, we know we end up back at full employment levels of output, which means there's ultimately no change in Y, and the price level is higher. So all of the increases in the money supply are eventually going to be absorbed as just increases in the price level. So we've looked at the long run neutrality of money in a couple of different ways here to prove that since money is not a resource, it's not going to affect potential output in an economy. So these are sort of the key takeaways. When the economy is at full employment, changes in the money supply have no effect on real output in the long run. And in the long run, the growth rate of the money supply determines the growth rate of the price level. That's it. And that's what we saw right here. The growth in the money supply determines the growth rate in the price level because it can't affect potential output. And that's according to the quantity theory of money. So those are the long run implications of monetary policy that you want to be really familiar with. And now we're going to head into the long run implications of fiscal policy. So these fall into like three major groups. One, we want to consider the long run implications of fiscal policy on the budget balance. And you'll remember that the budget balance is equal to government receipts minus government outlays. Government receipts predominantly comes from taxes, government outlays in the form of government spending on goods and services, and government transfers. When there's changes in the budget balance, that is probably going to have an impact on changes in real interest rates, all else equal. And so we're going to be looking at how does a change in a long run fiscal policy affect real interest rates, and then what are the implications for the changes in real interest rates on long run economic growth. So these are the connections that we want to make when we're talking about long run implications of fiscal policy. So you'll remember that regardless of the starting point, regardless of the initial condition of the budget balance, expansionary fiscal policy, all else equal, is going to lead to an increase in the real interest rate. So what that means is when the budget balance is negative, that means that government revenues are less than government outlays, receipts are less than outlays, then the government is running a deficit. Well, if the government enacts expansionary fiscal policy, that's going to cause receipts to go down, or, right, because a tax cut would cause government revenue to go down, or outlays to increase, or both, right? So either way, the deficit is going to get bigger, which requires the government to borrow money to pay for the spending it's doing that it hasn't collected the revenue to pay for. So an increase in government borrowing leads to an increase in the demand for loanable funds, which drives up the real interest rate. When the budget balance is zero, we know the government is running a balanced budget, but again, ceteris paribus, expansionary fiscal policy is going to cause receipts to go down and or outlays to go up, which will put the government budget balance into a deficit, again, requiring the government to borrow money, which leads to an increase in the demand for loanable funds and an increase in the real interest rate. And finally, the less common example is when the budget balance is positive and the government is running a surplus. Expansionary fiscal policy will move the budget balance towards a deficit. So if it's going to spend down its surplus, and a government surplus is the supply of loanable funds. It's like money sitting in the government's bank account. So if the government has to run down its surplus to pay for expansionary policy, the supply of loanable funds will decrease, which also causes the real interest rate to rise. So just remember to connect changes in the budget balance to the loanable funds market in order to see what happens to real interest rates. Crowding out, you'll remember, is the decrease in private investment spending that results from an increase in real interest rates produced by an increase in government borrowing or a decrease in government savings that results from expansionary fiscal policy. And remember that private domestic investment spending is the major driver of economic growth because investment spending is spending on productive capacity, spending on capital stock. So productive capacity is a function of land, labor, and capital. And all else equal, if there's a decrease in investment spending, then we're going to decrease the rate at which productive capacity is added to the economy, and that is going to slow economic growth. So when real interest rates rise, investment spending falls. And so all else equal, a decrease in investment spending causes the economic growth rate to slow. And the reason why is because fewer capital goods are being added to the economy's productive capacity. One of the most important long-run implications of fiscal policy for the purpose of AP Macro is understanding all else equal that the increase in real interest rate that can be triggered by expansionary fiscal policy may crowd out private domestic investment spending. All right, as you know, right now, our government is engaged in massive expansionary fiscal policy as well as the Fed. And so the Fed's actions are keeping interest rates down while the increase in government borrowing may be putting upward pressure on them. Okay, so now one of the other things you want to be able to do is show crowding out in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, or at least be able to describe conceptually how you would illustrate crowding out in an ADAS model. So let's assume the economy is operating in a recessionary gap and that the government is currently operating a balanced budget. So we've got this recessionary gap where current output is less than potential output, and the government is going to enact some expansionary fiscal policy in order to increase aggregate demand and close the gap. So we know the government can either increase government spending or it can decrease taxes. Either or both of those things will cause aggregate demand to increase to let's say AD2. That gives us a new equilibrium here, right? But the expansionary fiscal policy is going to cause the budget balance to move into a deficit, which causes the demand for loanable funds to increase, which drives up real interest rates, which crowds out domestic private investment spending. And so the decrease in investment spending is going to cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. And so we could end up in a new equilibrium here at E3, so if the goal of the policy was to close the gap, the increase in real interest rates might be offset by a decrease in investment spending. And this is crowding out in the ADAS model. So remember, if you're talking about complete crowding out, then all of the increases in aggregate demand would be offset by decreases in investment spending. All right. Okay, so understanding the implications of expansionary fiscal policy for the budget balance, the debt burden, the interest on the debt that the government has to pay, as well as crowding out, are key concepts for AP macroeconomics. All right, so finally, we're going to put this together with economic growth. So we know that economic growth is measured as the growth rate in real GDP per capita over time. And here is a nice graph from Fred showing the increases in real GDP per capita over time in the United States from a little before 1950 to about 2019. And you can see this general upward trend. Sometimes the growth rate is increasing, sometimes it's falling, sometimes it's negative, but we generally see this increase over time. Okay, we show economic growth using our AP macroeconomic models in the PPC and in the ADAS model. We show it in the PPC model by shifting the PPC curve out and to the right, and we show it in the ADAS model by shifting long-run aggregate supply to the right. So the getting long run aggregate supply over here, you could have an increase in aggregate demand that's a function of increased investment spending, which will increase the potential output of the economy. You can also have short run increases in short run aggregate supply that become permanent, which lead to increases in the productive capacity of an economy. So whether aggregate demand has brought LRAS along or SRAS has brought LRAS along, we model economic growth as an increase in long-run aggregate supply, indicating that when the economy is operating at full employment levels of output, we can produce more output than we could before. So this is how we model economic growth. And remember, back in Unit 1, you learned what the shift factors of the PPC were. You can talk the PPC shifts because of an increase in the amount of resources that an economy has or an increase in the productivity of existing resources. So the resources are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. When we talk about increases in land, we're talking about an increase in the amount of natural resources. Increases in labor are an increase in the number of workers, not to be confused with human capital, and then increases in capital. So if the economy acquires more resources, then the PPC curve is going to shift to the right. Now, if the economy figures out how to use its existing resources more productively, how to get more output out of each input, then we're going to see an increase in a shift out of the PPC as well. And those determinants of productivity you learned about in a previous lesson: technological advancement, the amount of physical capital per worker, and the amount of human capital per worker. So if technology advances, if there's an increase in physical capital per worker and or an increase in human capital per worker, you're going to get more output from a given amount of inputs. So those are the two sources of economic growth. And now we can connect that to fiscal policy again, because we can think about some of the fiscal policies the government is implementing can impact these things and will therefore impact long-run economic growth. So here are some of those government policies that will affect technological advancement, the amount of physical capital per worker, and the amount of human capital per worker. Subsidies or tax credits for firms that engage in research and development will increase the rate at which technology advances, and government spending on some of the programs that it operates also lead to technological innovation that have economy-wide applications. So like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the US Department of Agriculture. You're hearing in the news about government agencies whose research leads to technological innovation that can be applied to the economy as a whole. Government policies can also affect the amount of physical capital per worker. So their government can use subsidies or tax credits to incentivize firms to engage in more investment spending on physical capital. And the government can spend money on infrastructure, which effectively increases the amount of physical capital per worker in the economy. Remember, infrastructure is roads, bridges, dams, tunnels, ports, information systems. All kinds of things constitute infrastructure. Human capital per worker can also be influenced by government policies. Again, the government can provide subsidies or tax credits to firms that provide job training or education to its employees, and government can spend money directly on education and job training. For example, the GI Bill, Pell Grants, Stafford loans, those are all examples of government programs that increase the educational attainment of the workforce, which produces increases in human capital. So there is not all government spending is created equal when it comes to economic growth. Some dollars are just transfers, but other dollars contribute directly to the productive capacity of an economy. Okay, so now let's just connect all of the dots here. So what I want you to see here is the relationship between some amount of consumer and capital goods and long run economic growth. So if we have a point here on the PPC, where if we only produce consumer goods, our PPC curve would shift inward over time because capital wears out over time. And you might have learned in your AP Macro course that depreciation is the term used to describe the rate at which capital wears out. So you need to be producing some amount of capital goods this year just to be able to have the same amount of productive capacity next year. Right? You have to do some spending this year on capital goods in addition to whatever consumer goods you are producing. So let's assume that the economy is producing at this point on its PPC, which corresponds with this amount of real GDP. And let's say that this level of real GDP goes with $10,000 worth of real GDP per capita. And so if this is the point at which we're producing this year, then the long run aggregate supply curve is not going to shift next year. It's going to be here next year as well. Now, what happens if the economy changes the production combinations that it's producing, and we produce some level of consumer goods and capital goods here that's associated with a 5% increase in next year's productive capacity? So if we increase the amount of capital goods that we are producing, we see the opportunity cost is we have to give up some current consumption, we have to give up some consumer goods. But what this means is if we're producing this many capital goods, not only do we have enough to produce the same amount of output next year, we actually can produce 5% more. And that might be analogous to real GDP next year of $10,500. Now, what if we increase even more? And let's say we produce some combination of capital goods and consumer goods associated with adding 10% productive capacity to our economy. So if we move from this point here this year to that point there, then that means instead of having 5% economic growth, we're going to have 10% economic growth. So this year's increases in capital goods are next year's productive capacity. So the more capital goods you're producing this year, the faster the rate at which long run aggregate supply is going to increase and real GDP per capita is going to increase. And we know that there are some government policies that are designed to impact where the economy is producing in terms of consumer goods and capital goods. So tax credits on interest income would cause an increase in the amount of savings because consumers would spend less today to earn more income on their savings. That would lead to an increase in the supply of loanable funds, which drives down real interest rates, which leads to an increase in investment spending. That would move us from a point here to a point here. Investment tax credits, right? That would be a tax cut for firms that engage in investment spending. That would have a similar effect of incentivizing firms to produce more productive capacity today. Deregulation is another supply side policy. It's not changing the rate at which it's not changing the combination of consumer goods and capital goods we're producing, but it does make it cheaper and easier for firms to produce. And if those increases in short run aggregate supply become permanent, then long run aggregate supply is going to increase as well because fewer of our resources are devoted towards complying with regulations. Whether or not that is a good or a bad thing for the economy is a subject for another time. Now, maybe the most controversial of the supply side policies is the idea that a decrease in income taxes will incentivize more workers to work or the current workers to work more hours, which would increase long run aggregate supply as well because we're basically adding labor. Right? So we'd be increasing our productive capacity. So these are all examples of government policies that can influence either where we're producing in terms of consumer goods and capital goods, or the rate at which the PPC is shifting out, or the long run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right. Okay, so now we can put it all together with a couple of quick FRQs. I'm going to focus on the Phillips curve FRQs tonight, and next week when we do our unit 4 and 5 reviews, we'll take a look, units 3, 4, and 5 reviews, we'll focus on the monetary and fiscal policy parts of this unit. So this is the 2013 question 3. And it starts by reminding us that inflation and expected inflation are important determinants of economic activity. Part A asks us to draw a correctly labeled graph of a short-run Phillips curve. So for part A, you would want to have inflation on your vertical axis, unemployment on your horizontal axis, and show that short-run trade-off with a downward sloping short-run Phillips curve. Part B says, using your graph in Part A, show the effect of an increase in the expected rate of inflation. So on the graph in Part A, we're going to show an increase in the expected rate of inflation, means that we are going to see a higher inflation rate associated with every level of unemployment, and we can show that as a shift to the right of the short-run Phillips curve. So there would be Part B. Part C asks, what is the effect of the increase in the expected rate of inflation on the long run Phillips curve? Well, we're not graphing it, so we're not showing it, but we can certainly assert there's no effect on the long run Phillips curve due to a change in the expected rate of inflation. Right? The only thing that shifts the long run Phillips curve is a change in the natural rate of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment is a function of frictional and structural unemployment. Those are not impacted by changes in expectations of inflation. So now part D asks, given the increase in the expected rate of inflation from part B, will the nominal interest rate on new loans increase, decrease, or remain unchanged? And then D2 asks, what happens to the real interest rate? So let's bring up our Fisher equation. The real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. So remember, when people enter into economic agreements, they do so based on some desired real interest rate. So people who take out loans don't want to pay any more than some real interest rate, and people who issue loans don't want to earn at least some real interest rate. And so if the expected rate of inflation increases, then what's going to happen is people are going to build into their nominal interest rates the change needed in order to secure the real interest rate they were looking for to begin with. And so nominal interest rates are going to rise and real interest rates are going to remain unchanged. So the nominal interest rate on new loans is going to increase because people build into their decision making some new expectation of inflation, and the nominal rates are going to reflect those changes based on the real rate of return that's desired. Okay, and so once we know that the nominal interest rate rises with the expected rate of inflation, we know that the real interest rate is going to remain unchanged. Finally, Part E asks us to assume that the nominal interest rate is 8% and that borrowers and lenders expect the rate of inflation to be 3% and the growth rate of real GDP to be 4%, and we're asked to calculate the real interest rate. So we know that when we're looking for real interest rate, it's equal to the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. We're told the nominal interest rate is 8%, and we're told that the expected rate of inflation is 3%. That gives us a real interest rate of 5%. The growth rate for real GDP of 4% is just a distractor. You don't need it to solve for the real interest rate in this example. So that would be how you would answer this particular FRQ. And let's just do one more quickly, because I really want you to see how including some expectation of inflation into your short run Phillips curve is going to help you answer these questions. So we're told to assume that the expected rate of inflation in a country is 3% and the current unemployment rate is 6% and the natural rate of unemployment is 4%. We have to draw a correctly labeled graph of the short and long run Phillips curves and label the current short run equilibrium as point X and plot the numerical values on the graph. So let's start with the easy part. Okay, we have inflation and unemployment. We know that in the short run, we have an inverse relationship, and in the long run, there is no relationship. And the long run Phillips curve shows that the economy can be at equilibrium at any rate of inflation. Now, I'm labeling my short run Phillips curve with a 3% expected inflation rate. And so what that means is when the economy is in long run equilibrium, the current inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. So this point here would be where our 3% inflation rate would be, and we know the natural unemployment rate is 4%. So this is the first piece of the puzzle. And now we have to find a point X that shows that the current unemployment rate is 6%. So 6 is bigger than 4. So our 6% unemployment rate has to be over here. And that's going to correspond with some new rate of inflation that is less than 3%, right? Because we're moving up along this axis, we're moving down along this axis, which gives us the answer to the next question. B asks, is the actual inflation rate greater than, less than, or equal to the expected rate of 3%? Once we've put this 3% here, do you see how easy this makes it? So we can say the actual inflation rate is less than the expected inflation rate of 3% in our short run recessionary gap. Okay, part C asks us to assume that loans were made taking into account the expected inflation rate of 3%, and we have to determine if lenders will be better off or worse off after they realize the actual inflation rate identified in part B, and then we have to explain our answer. So let's use our Fisher equation again. The real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. Well, if the actual rate of inflation is lower than the expected rate of inflation, then this part of the equation is smaller. And since we're realizing this after the fact, after we've already entered into our contract with some nominal real interest rate, then if this number is going down and this number is constant, this number is going up. So if the actual rate of inflation is lower than the expected rate of inflation, lenders will be better off because they are getting a higher real interest rate in return. Borrowers are worse off because they're paying a higher real interest rate. So you can use this equation to answer the question, but you can also answer it conceptually by recognizing that the borrowers, when there is unanticipated deflation, or when the expected rate of when the actual rate of inflation is lower than the expected rate of inflation, lenders benefit because they're being paid back with dollars that have more purchasing power than they anticipated, because the inflation has not eroded the purchasing power of that money as much as was expected. All right, and then part D asks, based on the relationship between the actual and expected inflation rates identified in part A, what happens to the natural rate of unemployment in the long run? And hopefully you know that the natural rate of unemployment is a function of the frictional unemployment rate and the structural unemployment rate, and changes in expectations of inflation do not affect frictional or structural unemployment. So there will be no change to the natural rate of unemployment in the long run. All right, so those are two Phillips curve questions that really get you thinking about the relationship between expectations and actual inflation rates, connecting that to the macroeconomy, the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And that brings us to the end of our Unit 5 review. So what we've done tonight is examined all of these topics to see really that the Phillips curve model is used to illustrate the relationship between inflation and unemployment. We talked about at length about the long run implications of monetary and fiscal policy, and we talked about economic growth, how we graph it, what it looks like, and what influences the rate at which it occurs, both in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy. So that brings us to an end to our lesson. As always, we just finish up with a reminder that if you are looking for a device or internet connectivity to be able to take your AP exams, or you know somebody who's looking for those things, please reach out to cb.org/tech. And I thank you very much for being here on a Friday. If you're watching live, if you're watching after the fact, good for you for continuing to review for your 2020 AP Macroeconomics exam. Thank you so much for watching.